As we discovered in the last episode, archaic and classical Greece was not a single country, but rather a collection of small, independent city-states surrounding the Aegean Sea. The ancient Greek word for city was polis, which is where we get the words politics, police, polite, and metropolis. And each polis had a slightly different culture, identity, and way of organising itself. And it's the way that each polis chose to organise itself that makes them so interesting. Each method can tell us something about how power can be spread throughout society, and who or what is important or fair. The Hellenes proved that there is nothing completely natural about any society. Instead, social organisation is the result of the choices we make as a society, and those ideas can still apply today. So how were Greek societies organised, and how was power distributed? There were three main ways of organising society, all of which spread power differently: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. One way of distributing power was to give it to a single person, a king or tyrant. The Hellenes called this system monarchy. Mono means one, and archon means ruler, so monarchy means rule by one. Oligarchy was another system which spread power differently. Oligos means few, and once again, archon means rule, so oligarchy was rule by a few. In theory, these few were supposed to be the smartest or most trained, but often it meant the strongest or richest in society. The last main way of spreading power was called democracy. Demos means people, so democracy translates to rule of the people. Unlike monarchy or oligarchy, democracy was complicated. It wasn't just a small group of elites making decisions or a single man. Democracy relied on every citizen knowing a lot of information and voting for the right path. So what were key social groups within ancient Greece? Which groups had power and which groups didn't? Macedonia was a monarchy, which meant that at the top of the social ladder was a basileus, which means king or emperor. This was usually passed from father to son, but the Macedonians were known for having brothers and half-brothers quarrelling once fathers died. Below the basileus were various satraps. Satraps were governors who ruled provinces like mini-kings. This became more important as the Macedonian Empire grew, as large empires were difficult to govern. Satraps had a lot of power over regular citizens, who could only advise rather than making actual decisions. The least powerful people in this society were slaves, who were often captured during war. Slaves were common in ancient Greece, but Macedonia had relatively few slaves when compared to other city-states. Sparta, as an oligarchy, was ruled by a few who oversaw a strict, militaristic, structured society. Spartans, or Laconians, performed very specific roles, and their aim was to be the best at what they did. They had little choice in the role they could perform, because what an individual wanted wasn't as important as what they saw as the good of society as a whole. At the top of the social ladder there were ephors, an elite council of 5 men who were elected every year as representative rulers. Based on their ability to rule well, they were appointed by the citizens of Sparta, or Spartiates. Spartiates were men who had undertaken the agoge, which was a brutal militaristic training from the age of 7, and were expected to be highly capable soldiers for most of their lives. Weakness was not tolerated amongst Spartiates, and there were many stories of weak babies being left to die so as to keep the Spartiate population small but strong. The word Spartiate means equal, and in return for being effective soldiers, the Spartans were given an equal parcel of land and wealth, so there were no rich or poor citizens. Below the Spartiates, however, were periakoi, who weren't citizens. They were the craftsmen and merchants who built and traded the things that the state needed, like clothes, armour, weapons for the Spartiates to use, and food to feed the population. Below the periakoi was the biggest segment of society, the helots. The helots were an underclass of state-owned slaves who, like land and wealth, were portioned out to the Spartiates to do most of the work for them. The fact that the helots did the labouring allowed the Spartiates to spend their time training for war. The Spartan state was so dependent on the helots that there were as many as 9 helots for every Spartiate. This didn't mean that they were appreciated though. In fact, the helots were treated very poorly, being beaten and punished harshly for any misbehaviour, and often just as a reminder of their position at the bottom of the ladder. In fact, to graduate from the agoge, the Spartiate boys were sent into the countryside to live in the wild, stalking the strongest helots they could find, whom they'd kill. This was not seen as a crime, but rather a service to the state. The citizens of Athens saw themselves as equals too, but in a different way. Economically, they could be rich, poor, and anything in between, but all were equal politically. Whereas only 5 ephors made the decisions in Sparta, all citizens in Athens made decisions through voting on specific issues. They would meet in an assembly, or ecclesia, and any citizen was allowed to stand up and take a turn trying to convince the citizens around them to vote in their preferred direction. All Athenian citizens could serve in government positions. Rather than appoint the best, people were randomly chosen by a lottery system. Like a modern day jury, regular people were chosen randomly and were expected to perform serious tasks and make serious decisions. Voting in the assembly or serving as a government official was an option only available to citizens though. There were a number of classes below who weren't allowed to take part in governing Athens. The next class down were the medics. Like citizens, they could be rich or poor or have any job, but the medics were foreigners or had parents who weren't citizens and as such were excluded from government. Even though medics were second to citizens, thousands were attracted to Athens because it was prosperous and offered many opportunities to earn a living or even make a fortune, which they were allowed and even encouraged to do. Athens wasn't a freedom-loving wonderland though. It also had slaves. Some slaves were well treated and served as tutors, cleaners, cooks, and even factory workers. They could own property and even buy their freedom. Other slaves, however, were forced to work in horrific conditions, working in the silver and iron ore mines, even at a very young age. These different systems of distributing power didn't just change how government worked or who made decisions. They affected the culture of the polis itself, each city-state developing distinctive cultures of their own. So how were the cultures of each polis different, and what was each polis known for? The Athenians were known for being open, diverse, and tolerant. They were a wealthy society that attracted all sorts of medics to live and work and contribute to Athenian culture. The Spartans were much more conservative. Everyone's role in society and their wealth was strictly controlled, and conforming to society was mandatory. Athenian citizens were all entitled to have a say, and this led to verbose citizens who debated issues constantly, expressing their opinions in their art, philosophy, and culture, in the town square, the courts, and the assembly. The Spartans, by contrast, were laconic in speech, saying little and getting straight to the point. In fact, the word laconic comes from Laconia, the area in which Sparta could be found. Helots, Perikoi, and Spartiates all had clear roles and were expected to be the best that they could be within those roles. There was no room for debate. This controlled way of doing things was stable, and ephors were expected to be restrained and considered in how they ruled. Democracy, though, was prone to shifting public opinion. Voting in the assembly was regularly swayed by arguments that led to reckless mistakes, including unaffordable spending and ill-considered wars. Regardless of their cultural differences, the one thing that both the Spartans and Athenians could agree on was that they were more advanced than the Macedonians, who had a monarchy and worse, didn't even speak Greek. The Hellenes were quite often prejudiced against non-Greek speakers, looking down on them and excluding them from events like the Olympic Games. To the Hellenes, non-Greek speakers sounded like they were saying "ba ba 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 ba," and they mocked them for this, calling them barbarians. According to most Hellenes, monarchies and tyrannies were something to avoid. Their citizens were basically slaves, and they simply couldn't compete with the more advanced Greek oligarchies and democracies like Sparta and Athens. This idea was proven wrong in 338 BCE, when the Macedonians defeated all Greek resistance and, with their systems of a basileus and mini-kings or satraps, they went on to create a massive Macedonian empire.